talk more about this. Joining me right now, CNN legal analyst and former federal prosecutor Shan Wu. All right, Shan, good to see you.
Good to see you, Fred.
All right, so, you know, while there have been some accusations coming from the president to, you know, the governor, fraudulence, you know, is at the root here. None of that has been proven. So thus far, it still appears as though nothing untoward has happened here, but now this account is really precipitated by the fact that it is such a narrow margin between the candidates in these three races, you know, the commissioner for agriculture, but the most important ones that the nation is watching is the U.S. Senate and the Florida governor race. So, so Shan, help put to rest, I guess, for people who have any real reservations about whether there's a legal road ahead, you know, for these races.
There is no cause for alarm. One of the things that we hope that we have learned, but I don't think we have since Bush versus Gore, is that there is a process. I mean, as you just pointed out, this is a very narrow margin at work here, and that's what's triggered the automatic recount. There's a process, and they're doing it. There's no crisis. There's no need to be in a huge hurry from a legal point of view to hurriedly get the final results. There is a process, and I think what's really important, everyone is, of course, reminded of the presidential election and the recount in Bush versus Gore. You know, the really important thing is this is a time for judicial restraint. I mean, one of the great controversies, and personally I think a terribly negative outgrowth of the Bush versus Gore case, was that the Supreme Court unnecessarily reached out and interfered with the electoral process. There was a process that could go on. I'm a believer in count every vote, and they should let that get done. Of course, there's politics involved. If someone's watching their vote count go down, they want to get in there and do something about it. Transparency is fine. The court says show the defective ballots, that's all fine. But I think for us as the public viewing this, what's really important to understand is that there's not a legal crisis, certainly not a constitutional crisis, and really it would be good if the courts stayed out of it and let the states do their job and go through the process.
And when you talk about defective ballots, that's what people remember from 2000. I was there for a very long time as a reporter, you know, covering that, and it was the pregnant chads, the hanging chads, all of that. That's not the issue here. There is already a deadline put in place, today being the deadline, noontime, for all the ballots in all counties to be in, and it wasn't a case of, you know, the next day after midterm elections, you know, polls closed, that all of the tallying, all of the, you know, all the numbers were in. And that, I guess, is part of the frustration. So many people are trying to figure out why is it, you know, that all the numbers weren't in by the next day so that all the races could be called. So help people understand why that is.
First of all, it's not unusual for all the results not to be in. And we all do remember the hanging chads, that type of literally physical defective nature of a ballot. But there can be other issues too. We've heard the terms undervoting and overvoting. One where someone only votes for a part of the ballot's only completed, overvoting being the opposite problem. People have filled out the ballot excessively. Those can be classified as defective as well. And so one of the core challenges right now is that Scott wants to see all the defective ballots to make sure that it's okay to count them. And so those sorts of processes, you know, people have thought about this, and the states do elections all the time. And so they have these categories, they have the processes for taking care of this. And I think it's important for folks to understand that it's not unusual for there to be delays. This is not the first time these sorts of issues have come up. Now, certainly there appears to be a problem in Broward County. There's been, over the years, there have been repeated problems with it in terms of, you know, ballots being missing, errors being done, and that's certainly something that needs to be addressed. But in terms of the overall process, it's not unusual for it not to be completely done the next day. There's nothing particularly odd about that, and I think, you know, we need to remember that when we look at these situations.
And how confident should people be about this machine recount versus a hand recount? So the machine recount to be completed by this Thursday for these Florida races, and then apparently if even then there are some discrepancies, then potentially, or I should say, in the case that it looks like there will be a less than 0.25% you know, difference between the candidates, then it will go to a hand recount. So, you know, explain, I guess, the proficiency of machine versus hand recounts.
Well, I'm not an expert on the technology in the recounts, but generally speaking, the idea here is you're looking for gross differences, gross abnormalities. So when we see a margin that is so close that, you know, there are statisticians who might say that's basically a statistical tie. So they're going to want to recheck those numbers. The machine does that first, and then if it has gotten even worse, meaning it's more narrow at that point, then there's the idea that human beings need to do the manual recount. Now, when you are counting thousands and thousands of votes, you may make errors when you're a human being. So the problem is, as you get smaller and smaller on that margin of error, there's always going to be mistakes being made, and that's the difficulty with it. But I think what we need to keep in mind is we're looking for large-scale errors, things that are really going to shift in a large way, and if there's been some massive problem with things miscounted, improperly counted, or missing.
All right. Shan Wu, good to see you. Thanks so much.
Good to see you. Sure.